At 23:44 on a Thursday night in November, the airspace management computer at Sheremetyevo International Airport's secondary radar facility logged 400 new transponder contacts entering the Moscow flight information region from the southwest. The contacts appeared at an altitude of 180 meters in a loose formation spread across a 90-kilometer lateral arc, each one broadcasting a valid Mode C transponder code in the frequency range assigned to commercial last-mile cargo delivery drones operated by 3 logistics companies that held active permits to fly night routes into the Moscow metropolitan distribution network. The contacts were moving at 87 kilometers per hour. They were below the altitude floor of Sheremetyevo's primary surveillance radar. They were inside every legal parameter for permitted autonomous cargo operations. The airspace management computer flagged none of them. It logged them, categorized them as routine commercial traffic, and moved on to the 34 other active contacts in its processing queue. Not one of the 400 contacts was carrying a package. Each one was a Ukrainian-modified Bober FPV drone, a platform with a 94-centimeter wingspan, a carbon fiber frame, a 22-minute flight endurance on its primary cell, and a 1.8-kilogram shaped charge warhead bolted to its undercarriage where a cargo pod would normally sit. Each one had been preloaded with a transponder unit, commercially available, legally purchasable, the kind used by delivery operators across Russia, broadcasting a cloned identifier harvested from a database of 800 active Moscow region cargo drone permits, obtained 6 weeks earlier through a cyber attack on a logistics company's fleet management server. Each one had been launched from a network of concealed positions inside Ukraine, Belgorod Oblast's contested edge, and, in what would later become the most legally and strategically significant detail of the entire operation, from 3 sites inside Russian territory itself, operated by assets whose identities have never been established. This is what happened next. The operation had a name, KHVYLIA Wave. It had been planned for 4 months by a unit inside Ukrainian military intelligence, the GUR, working in coordination with a technical cell that had spent 8 weeks reverse engineering the Moscow air defense architecture from publicly available flight restriction data, leaked Rosaviatsia internal circulars, and satellite imagery of the radar infrastructure protecting the Russian capital. The Moscow air defense zone is not a single system. It is a series of overlapping rings. The outermost ring, the A-135 Amur ballistic missile defense system, is designed to intercept warheads at altitudes between 5 and 800 kilometers. It is irrelevant to a drone flying at 180 meters. The next ring is the S-400 Triumph, deployed at 8 known sites in the Moscow Oblast, optimized for targets above 100 meters traveling at speeds consistent with jet aircraft or cruise missiles. Below that is the Pantsir S-1 and Pantsir S-2 network, short-range systems designed for exactly this threat altitude. But the Pantsir coverage over Moscow is not continuous. It is nodal. There are gaps between nodes, and those gaps, at 180 meters altitude and 87 kilometers per hour, are navigable if you know precisely where they are and can distribute 400 objects across the geometry of the gaps simultaneously. Rozum, the AI system that had executed Operation Prize Rack over eastern Ukraine 7 months earlier, had been given a new problem. Its previous task had been electromagnetic saturation. Its new task was geometric infiltration. Calculate the routing for 400 individual drones that would bring each one through a Pantsir coverage gap at the correct speed and altitude to arrive at its assigned target within a 40-second window of all the others. The 40-second window was not aesthetic. It was operational. Russian Pantsir crews have a retargeting cycle of approximately 4 seconds per engagement. 40 Pantsir systems defending the Moscow core zone, each capable of engaging roughly 1 target per 4-second cycle, could theoretically service 600 targets per minute. But that calculation assumes each system can detect, classify, and queue targets without interference. Rozum's routing plan ensured that all 400 contacts would become visible to the Pantsir network simultaneously, not gradually, not in waves, but in a single 40-second pulse of acquired targets, creating a 600 target per minute demand against a 600 target per minute theoretical maximum, with zero margin for system latency, operator reaction time, or the 3 seconds it takes a Pantsir missile to reach a target at 180 meters.
The targeting assignments were not random. Of the 400 drones, 180 were assigned to what the GUR target package designated as Tier 1, 6 facilities. The Solnechnogorsk Early Warning Radar Station, 37 kilometers northwest of central Moscow, whose over-the-horizon radar provided the primary long-range detection layer for the capital's Air Defense Command. The 607th Main Center for Warning About Missile Attacks in Korolov, northeast of Moscow, whose automated systems processed incoming data from Russia's space-based infrared early warning satellites and distributed threat assessments to every air defense battery in the Western Military District. 3 communications relay nodes, hardened facilities disguised as commercial cellular infrastructure that carried encrypted data traffic between Moscow's Air Defense Command Center and the outlying S-400 batteries, and a single building inside the Kodinka military compound in northwestern Moscow, a low, unremarkable 3-story structure that Russian open-source researchers had identified as housing the primary operations room for Moscow Air Defense District Command. The room where, if everything was functioning correctly, a general officer was watching every one of the 400 contacts currently being categorized as cargo drones. The remaining 220 drones were Tier 2, suppression assets assigned to engage every Pantsir S-1 and Pantsir S-2 radar vehicle at 8 identified battery positions around the Moscow outer ring the moment the Tier 1 strike became visible to the air defense network. Their job was not to destroy the Pantsirs. Their job was to force the Pantsir crews to engage them instead of the Tier 1 drones in the 40-second window before the Tier 1 warheads detonated. It was, in the vocabulary of combined arms doctrine, a classic suppression of enemy air defense operation, SEAD, executed entirely with sub-kilogram FPV drones from inside Russian airspace using cloned civilian transponders against a target set that included the nerve center of Russian air defense over its own capital city. At 23:51:04, Rozum issued the acceleration command to all 400 drones simultaneously. Each drone increased speed from 87 kilometers per hour to 140 kilometers per hour and dropped altitude from 180 meters to 55 meters. At 55 meters and 140 kilometers per hour, the Mode C transponder codes, which had been valid at the legally permitted cargo altitude of 180 meters, were now outside their authorized flight envelope. The Sheremetyevo airspace computer flagged all 400 contacts simultaneously as altitude violations and issued automated radio calls on the cargo operator frequencies. No one answered. The computer escalated to a human controller. The human controller reached for a phone. At 23:51:09, 5 seconds after the acceleration command, the Moscow Air Defense District Operations Room at Kodinka received an automated alert from the Sheremetyevo Airspace Management System. 400 civilian cargo drone contacts deviating from permitted parameters. The duty officer, a colonel whose role was air defense coordination, not civilian airspace management, looked at the alert, looked at the radar picture, and made the decision that any rational officer would make, given that Russia's skies had been full of civilian drone activity every night for 3 years. He classified it as a commercial operator malfunction event and passed it to the Civilian Aviation Authority duty desk. He had 127 seconds before the first warhead detonated. At 23:51:44, a Pantsir S-2 radar operator at a battery position 22 kilometers southwest of Moscow Center acquired 17 contacts crossing into his engagement zone on a non-standard heading at 55 meters. He had not received any air defense alert. He saw 17 objects moving faster than cargo drones move, lower than cargo drones are permitted to fly, on a heading toward a protected military facility. He did not wait for authorization. He activated his fire control radar and engaged. He destroyed 4 contacts in 18 seconds before his radar picture suddenly populated with 61 additional contacts entering his sector from 3 separate vectors. His target queue overflowed. He prioritized by range. He fired at the nearest 8 contacts. He destroyed 6 of them. The remaining 55 continued on their headings. He was still engaging when the Tier 1 drone assigned to his radar vehicle's antenna array detonated at a range of 11 meters, destroying the radar dish and killing 2 crew members in the vehicle's rear compartment. At 23:52:06, the Solnechnogorsk Early Warning Radar Station took 4 simultaneous impacts across its antenna array. The primary over-the-horizon radar went offline. The backup system, which operated on a separate power feed from an independent generator, came online automatically. It was struck by a 5th drone 19 seconds later that had
had been held in a loiter orbit 800 meters from the facility, assigned by Rosum as a backup strike asset triggered by the detection of any post-strike radar emission from the site. The backup system went offline. It did not come back online. At 23:52:31, the 607th Main Center in Korolov took 3 impacts. 2 struck the external communications antenna cluster on the facility's roof. 1 penetrated through a ventilation intake and detonated inside the building, killing 1 technician and injuring 4 others. The center's automated satellite early warning data processing continued. The core systems were hardened and survived, but its ability to transmit processed threat assessments to outlying batteries was reduced by 70% due to the antenna damage. The batteries were not blind. They were deaf. They could see what was in front of them. They could not hear what the command network was telling them about what was coming from directions they couldn't yet see. The 11-minute window Rosum had calculated closed at 23:55:44. By that point, Russian air defense had destroyed 212 of the 400 drones. Of those, 180 were Tier 2 suppression drones, meaning the Pantsir network had successfully prioritized them over the Tier 1 strike packages in the early engagement phase, exactly as Rosum had intended. The Tier 1 drones had a survival rate of 72%. Of the 180 drones assigned to 6 Tier 1 targets, 129 reached their assigned detonation points. The Kodinka operations room was struck by 11 drones. The building's ground floor was destroyed. The second floor, where the primary operations room was located, suffered catastrophic structural damage. The colonel who had classified the initial contact alert as a civilian malfunction event was killed by the second impact. The general officer commanding Moscow Air Defense District was in the building. He was not in the operations room. He had been in an adjacent corridor when the first drone came through the window. He survived. The operations room did not. The 3 communications relay nodes were each struck by between 4 and 7 drones. 2 were destroyed completely. 1 was damaged but remained partially functional, maintaining a degraded data link to 3 of the 8 S-400 batteries in the outer ring. For the following 6 hours, those 3 batteries were the only elements of Moscow's air defense network with a functioning connection to any command authority. The other 5 S-400 batteries were operational, missiles loaded, radars active, crews at their stations, but receiving no data, no threat picture, no coordination. They were 5 fully armed, fully capable weapons systems operating in complete informational isolation, each one making independent decisions about what was and was not a threat in its immediate sector, with no knowledge of what the other 4 were seeing. That condition, 5 independent, isolated, fully armed air defense batteries surrounding a capital city whose command network had just been surgically excised, was not a side effect of Operation KHVYLIA. It was the objective. The GUR's targeting logic had never been about destroying the batteries. Destroying the batteries would have required weapons those drones could not carry and would have provoked a response those planners could not afford. The objective was to sever the command network while leaving the weapon systems intact, because an intact, isolated, uncoordinated weapon system in a high-threat environment is more dangerous to the side operating it than a destroyed one. A destroyed Pantsir shoots nothing. An isolated Pantsir, receiving no IFF data, no deconfliction signals, no threat picture, and watching unknown contacts appear in its sector at irregular intervals, shoots at everything. At 0:17 on Friday morning, 33 minutes after the last KHVYLIA drone detonated, a Russian military helicopter, a Mi-8 carrying a signals relay team, dispatched from a facility north of Moscow to attempt to restore communications with the isolated S-400 batteries, was engaged by a Pantsir S-2 battery at a position 31 kilometers east of Kodinka. The battery's IFF interrogation system received no response from the helicopter. The Mi-8's military IFF transponder had been damaged by electromagnetic pulse effects from a nearby drone detonation earlier in the evening. The Pantsir crew had been awake for 19 hours, had been under attack, had lost contact with their command network, and were watching an unidentified rotary wing contact approaching from the direction of the facility that had just been struck. They fired 2 5.7 missiles, both connected. The helicopter went down in a field 4 kilometers north of the Moskva River. All 11 personnel aboard were killed. The Russian Ministry of Defense did not publish publicly acknowledge the helicopter loss for 11 days. When it did, it attributed the incident to technical failure during combat conditions. No further explanation was provided. By morning, Russian state media was reporting that Ukrainian drones had targeted Moscow overnight, and that air defense systems had successfully neutralized the majority of hostile contacts. The claim was technically accurate in terms of the numbers. 212 of 400 drones had been destroyed. It omitted that the 188 which were not destroyed had taken offline the primary early warning radar for the capital, destroyed the command operations room for Moscow Air Defense District, severed communications between command and 5 of 8 S-400 batteries, and created the conditions under which Russian air defense had shot down its own helicopter. All of that had been accomplished with 400 drones, weighing 3.2 kilograms each, built from commercial components, flown on cloned delivery transponder codes, and routed by an AI system that had needed 8 weeks of satellite imagery and 3 leaked administrative circulars to plan an operation that no air defense doctrine in the world had been designed to prevent, because no doctrine had been written for an enemy willing to disguise its weapons as the same commercial traffic that the city's own economy generated every night. In Washington, a classified assessment circulated within 72 hours described the operation as a successful demonstration of layered deception tactics at strategic depth, exploiting the boundary between civilian airspace management and military air defense as an operational seam. The assessment's final paragraph noted that the boundary being exploited was not unique to Russia. Every major urban air defense system in the world relies on the same fundamental assumption, that civilian transponder traffic is civilian. That assumption, the assessment stated, must now be considered operationally invalidated. In the days following KHVYLIA, satellite imagery showed engineering vehicles at the Solnechnogorsk radar site, portable antenna systems being erected at Kodinka, and increased air defense vehicle activity around all 8 S-400 battery positions in the Moscow ring. Russia was rebuilding. Russia was also simultaneously deploying counter-drone radar pickets at distances of up to 60 kilometers from the Moscow city boundary, establishing low-altitude radar coverage below the floor at which KHVYLIA had operated. The countermeasure was sound. It addressed the attack vector that had been used. Rosum had already been updated with the new radar picket positions. It had been updated within 48 hours of the first satellite imagery confirming their deployment. It was already calculating whether the new pickets created new electromagnetic gaps at different altitudes, whether those gaps were navigable at different speeds, whether a different transponder category, not cargo drones, something else, something Russia's civilian airspace was full of and would never consider restricting, provided a new cover layer. In a building in Kyiv that survives on generator power, in a room where the lights are kept low to reduce thermal signature, an AI system that means intellect in Ukrainian is doing what it was built to do. It is learning what you built to stop it. It is already planning around what you haven't built yet. And the next wave does not have a name yet because it has not needed one. It will need one soon.